All eyes on the Nigerian election and globally, all eyes on US President Donald Trump, who's followed through on his latest threat. He's announced that he will use emergency powers to build a wall on the US border with Mexico. Building the wall was a key pledge of Trump's campaign, remember. But Democrats have described the emergency as a gross abuse of power.
I'm going to be signing a national emergency, and it's been signed many times before. It's been signed by other presidents. From 1977 or so, it gave the presidents the power. There's rarely been a problem. They sign it. Nobody cares. I guess they weren't very exciting, but nobody cares. They sign it for far less important things in some cases, in many cases. We're talking about an invasion of our country with drugs, with human traffickers, with all types of criminals and gangs.
That was the US president talking a short while ago, saying this isn't a big deal, declaring an emergency. We're joined by our US correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, so we've been talking about this in the past. Will he, won't he? It's going ahead. Exactly what does this mean?
Well, it does tell us that the author of The Art of the Deal that touted his deal-making skills, Francis, was unable to find a compromise and make a deal with the leadership of the United States Congress, led now by a Democratic Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. And just some background here, in case people forget watching this. Remember, there was a government shutdown for 35 days. The compromise to reopen the government for 3 weeks, with that deadline being February 15th, was that congressional committees made up of Republican senators, Republican House members, Democratic senators, a bipartisan group would negotiate in those 3 weeks and come up with a spending bill that would fund the government for the foreseeable future, but would also then deal with this issue of funding for the wall. They agreed that they would appropriate $1.375 billion for some sort of barrier, not necessarily a wall, but specifically for border security, which means many things: technology, observation, part of a barrier. What they would agree to is 55 miles in new sort of barrier fencing type thing. The president not happy with that compromise. He wants $5.7 billion for a concrete wall barrier, or whatever you want to call it these days. He didn't get that money and has now declared a national emergency. So that's essentially the background to what we saw in the Rose Garden earlier today.
Does this mean the wall will be built? How much scope do the Democrats have to push back?
Well, Congress has the power of the purse, and this is why this is so controversial. The president is quite right that national emergencies have been declared by presidents in the past, including President Obama. I was just doing some research on some of the national emergencies, Francis, that President Obama enacted. I'll read you one of them. It says that the president... in 2012, this was what one of his 13 national emergencies, quote, blocking property of persons threatening peace and security and stability in Yemen. A similar one, blocking property of persons threatening peace and security in Ukraine. So there was no controversy around those because it didn't realign the appropriation of funds earmarked for other projects towards a specific project or pet project that President Obama had. What we are seeing President Trump attempt to do here is to redirect funding that has been appropriated for other projects, be that in the Department of Homeland Security, be that at the National Treasury, and to redirect that money towards some $6.5 billion in additional funding that Congress refused to give him. He is now saying that he's going to redirect funds. Of course, there's some constitutional challenges that we expect in the days ahead.
Well, what is Nancy Pelosi saying? So she's suggested that a wall will happen over her dead body, basically.
Yeah, you alluded to some of their reaction in that intro earlier, Francis. Let's listen to what Nancy Pelosi said yesterday in her weekly press conference, dealing specifically and responding to a question as to whether she would challenge this in court.
It's important to note that when the president declares this emergency, first of all, it's not an emergency, what's happening at the border. It's a humanitarian challenge to us. The president has tried to sell a bill of goods to American people. But putting that aside, just in terms of the president making an end run around Congress.
They have now also, Francis, come out with a statement. Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, the minority leader in the Senate, and Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Just allow me to read some of it. Declaring a national emergency would be a lawless act, a gross abuse of power of the presidency, and a desperate attempt to distract from the fact that the president broke his core promise to have Mexico pay for the wall. It goes on, Francis. I'm not going to read all of it, but it ends with this. The Congress will defend our constitutional authorities. Okay, so that means two options here. Essentially, what Nancy Pelosi can do in the House of Representatives is coalesce her Democratic colleagues and maybe some centrist Republicans to vote for a bill that would undermine this executive order, essentially, by the president in terms of the emergency appropriation here. It would then also have to pass by a two-thirds majority in the United States Senate to override a possible veto from President Trump. So there's a legislative avenue for Nancy Pelosi and Democrats, or they could challenge this in court. And as the president was alluding to in his remarks earlier, this is likely to end up at the Supreme Court in Washington, where conservatives currently have a 5-4 majority.
Sherwin, very quickly, isn't he playing political dice anyway? So funds will be diverted from maybe other good things, and apparently most Americans do not want a war.
Well, this is a game of cat and mouse. This is a political off-ramp for this president. Essentially, he has lost the negotiations with Congress around this wall. This is a president that doesn't like losing, does not like to be seen to be losing. And so this is very much a play towards that consistent base that has been his support since he became president. And essentially, he is saying to them, look, I'm trying everything I can here to deliver on this campaign promise, this long-standing promise that I'm going to build a wall. He is also, Francis, and this is worth noting, being criticized by some of the leaders within that base. Very vocal on social media, very vocal on channels like Fox News, criticizing the president, almost forcing his hand to do this national emergency. The legality, of course, of this act is going to be decided by the court, or be overridden by legislation in both the House and the Senate. But of course, to override a veto of this president, you need two-thirds in the House, two-thirds in the Senate, and that will force the president's hand.
All right, so it remains to be seen if the president will get his wall. Thank you very much, our U.S. correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease.